Here's an episode of How to Analyse Poetry from the Learning Cauldron. Today, we'll be looking at Carol Ann Duffy's poem, Mrs. Midas. Analysing poetry involves identifying and dissecting the literary techniques that the poet has used effectively to explore the theme or themes of a poem. In her poem, Mrs. Midas, Carol Ann Duffy explores the themes of greed, conflict, isolation, relationships, and change. The title of the poem, Mrs. Midas, is faintly familiar because of the name Midas. Many of us will have heard of King Midas, who was famous because of his golden touch. King Midas appeared in Ovid's Metamorphoses collection, and he was offered a wish by Dionysus, one of the gods. And his wish was that everything he touched turned to gold. So Carol Ann Duffy imagines what it would have been like for his wife, perhaps in a more modern day setting, if her husband came back and everything he touched was turning to gold. You will see references to the colour gold throughout this entire poem. If you have a little look, you'll see there are little wiggly lines there. Everything that I've underlined is a reference to the colour gold. So it's very clever. Everything he touched turned to gold, and the colour gold is imbued throughout the entire work. The poem begins with a short, matter-of-fact sentence in which we're told that it's late September, and of course September is the colour of golden leaves. It's written in the first person voice, in the voice of Mrs. Midas, and she's in the kitchen. It's the end of the day, she's cooking the supper, and there's a very relaxed, informal tone where she talks about the kitchen filling with the smell of itself, lovely personification there, the word choice of relaxed and gently, and then another nice image here, the simile that she wiped the glass of the other window like a brow. There's the use of sibilance here, smell of itself, relaxed and steamy breath, and we've also got the onomatopoeia of the snapping of a twig, which she sees her husband doing at the bottom of the garden when she looks through the window. So it all seems very normal, a wife in the kitchen looking out and seeing her husband coming home. But as she looks down the garden, the light's not good because it's evening, and she notices that the twig in his hand has turned to gold, and that's the first sign that something's not quite normal. And then he plucked a pear, nice use of alliteration of peas there, from a branch, and we notice that she's slightly aware of herself, a little bit arrogant perhaps, this little aside in parenthesis, we grew fondant d'automne, the name of the species of pear that they grew, and it sat in his palm like a light bulb on. So we've got excellent imagery here, the simile of like a light bulb, which gives us not only the shape, but the fact that this short, blunt sentence tells us it was on, also gives us the feel that this is a light bulb that is golden. And again, this is not quite normal. She's a little bit perplexed. Is he putting fairy lights on the tree? She's asking herself. And there's a tone there of almost whimsical, a whimsical tone. Her very down-to-earth approach continues. She describes exactly what happens. And as he comes into the house, there are words which suggest things are not the way they should be. The doorknobs gleam when he touches them. And it makes her think of a classroom situation when she was a child, where a history lesson talked of the field of the cloth of gold. Again, this reference to gold. And of Miss Macready, her teacher, so a slight nostalgic feel. He sat in the chair like a king on a burnished throne, another use of a simile there. And the look on his face, and this is where things become a little bit more worrying. It was strange, wild, vain. And there's a list. It's an asyndetic list. There are no conjunctions joining those adjectives, and it somehow intensifies the emotion here. We begin to worry about him, and we wonder what's happened to him. And she wonders too. She asks him, what in the name of God is going on? Very down-to-earth feel again. He starts to laugh. He's not got the measure of how serious his situation is yet, but she is beginning to worry. However, she tries to act as if everything's normal, and she serves up, and this is slightly humorous, corn on the cob. And of course, it's golden as well, and the shape of a corn on the cob kernel is the same of teeth. So when he has to spit out the kernels of the corn on the cob, they are the shape of the teeth of the rich, because rich people in the olden days would have had golden fillings and golden teeth. And then there's a list of the things that he touches, all of them of course turning to gold. And she's a bit worried by this time, and she pours his wine with a shaking hand, and that word choice reveals that she is more anxious. He may have been laughing, she's feeling anxious. And she watches almost in disbelief, having ascertained what type of wine it is, of course, because these things matter to Mrs. Midas. She watches as it turns from a glass to a goblet to a golden chalice, and there's a lovely alliteration and consonance of the G's and L's there. And moving on to the 5th stanza, this is when they've both realised how serious the situation is. She started to scream, nice sibilance there, and he sank to his knees. He's appreciated suddenly the folly of his wish that everything he touches turns to gold. He realises that his greed has got him into real trouble here. They calm down, and she finishes the wine on her own. Now there is, although this is a serious situation, there is a vein of humour right through this poem, and the fact that she bothered to finish the wine on her own is an example of this. Another example of the humour is where she tells him to keep his hands to himself. And that's the sort of thing at a disco, if somebody was annoying you, you might say, keep your hands to yourself. But here it's absolutely critical. If he touches her, she's going to turn to gold. So this is even more serious. She does very practical things. She gets the cat put out of the way into the cellar, moves the phone. But again here, her slightly aspirational personality comes to the fore. The toilet, I didn't mind, she said. Because of course, if you're aspiring to great things, you want a golden toilet in your house, don't you? So she's quite happy for him to turn that into gold. And then there's a lovely play on words as we move on to the next stanza. She says, look, we all have wishes granted. And here granted means admittedly. That's one meaning of the word granted. However, there is another meaning which she very quickly uses as well. But who, she says, has wishes granted as in fulfilled. So, great play on words here. And her frustration is boiling over into this short, one-word monosyllabic sentence, him. You can almost hear her saying it. And then she ponders gold for a little bit, and again her slightly aspirational personality comes through. She talks of aurum, which is the Latin word for gold, and she thinks about the qualities of gold, none of which are going to help him because they won't feed him and he will not become less thirsty if he drinks gold. So we can see that while gold may be great for spending and for buying things, from a practical point of view, it's actually of no use to him whatsoever. And she watches as he tries to light a cigarette, and again the humour comes to the fore because she watches the blue flame playing on its luteous stem, lovely use of consonants of L's there to extend that, and she thinks of a positive side of what's happened to him. You'll be able to give up smoking for good, because he's not going to be able to smoke if every cigarette that he touches turns to gold. Moving on to the 7th stanza, we start with a nice, short, blunt sentence. It's a minor sentence, there's no verb. Separate beds. And this is when the isolation theme starts to become even more evident in this poem. Separate, the word choice highlights that they are no longer going to be sleeping together and their once close relationship is over. Moving on, he's downstairs now because she's not prepared to sleep with him, and he's in the spare room, which he is turning into the tomb of Tutankhamun. Some nice alliteration there of the T's, and also the idea of the imagery. Tutankhamun was buried in a tomb with lots of gold, so therefore it's quite appropriate that she thinks as he's touching everything in the room and it's turning to gold, that the room is like the tomb of Tutankhamun. And then there's a sad tone here because she says, you see, we were passionate then. Look at the use of the past tense in those halcyon days. Halcyon days means days when everything was perfect. And we then see that their relationship was good and that his greed is spoiling it, has spoilt it, probably permanently. And there's a lovely use of imagery here, unwrapping each other rapidly like presents, the idea of like children on Christmas morning desperate to get into their presents, and their love for each other was such they couldn't wait to hold each other. But, and of course that shows a change in direction, now she fears that very hug, the honeyed embrace. Lovely use of colour again here, the colour of gold, and the idea of it being sticky and almost dangerous for her. Moving on to the next stanza, there's again a play on words. We often talk of someone having a heart of gold, meaning that they're a good person. But as she points out, when it comes to practicality, who can actually live with a heart of gold, a real heart made of gold? Well, you couldn't, could you? So therefore, this gift of his is not as practical and as ideal as he had thought when he wished for it. And of course, she realises the full implications. She is never now going to be able to have his child. They'd probably dreamt of having children together, and she dreams that night about what it could be like if this were to happen now with his new gift. And there's reference to ore, which is to do with metal. Its little tongue, little bit of alliteration there, and consonants, like a precious latch, like a little door latch, because it's made of metal, of course. And then the colour amber. Amber is actually fossilised tree or plant resin, and many fossils encapsulate or hold insects which have become stuck in them. And that's what this image is referring to. The idea, if you go to a museum, you might see flies or other insects which are embedded in this golden amber substance. And after the dream, when she realises she's not going to be able to bear his child, she wakes up to the streaming sun. Again, something anything golden. Moving on to the next stanza, again we're back to the practical approach of Mrs. Midas. So he had to move out. You can almost imagine her down at the pub telling her mates about how it happened. And then the sadness creeps in again and the isolation. She takes a caravan to a glade of its own, and she has to take him there in the darkness, and he's sitting in the back because he can't touch her, and she realises she feels foolish. She's the woman who married the fool who wished for gold. There's almost a nursery rhyme-like feel to that bit. And when we see the word choice of odd times here, it makes us realise that she did not visit him often. So he would be isolated from her and she from him. And this is very sad because we know that their relationship was once strong. You knew you were getting close, she says, because there were signs. He'd obviously tried to find some way of eating, but the trout had turned to gold. And he'd obviously tried to catch a hare, but it became a beautiful lemon mistake. Look at that lovely use of L's and M's there to highlight that. And his physical condition has deteriorated too. The word choice of thin and delirious. He's almost going mad with hunger and thirst. He also says that he's hearing the music of Pan. Now, Pan was also a god. He was the god of shepherds. And we think of King Midas, who had such a high status at the start of this poem, who is now hearing the music of the god of shepherds, how he has come down socially. And then again, we've got this clever use of things that are golden. That, she says, was the last straw. Now, of course, that was the last straw means that was it. I'd had enough, but the clever use of straw brings a golden element into this still. And now we move on to the final stanza of this very long poem, and she's furious with him. She talks of his idiocy and greed, but she says those are not actually the things that get to her most. It's the lack of thought for her. So she's a little bit self-obsessed here. She's thinking only of herself. And this short sentence sums that up. Pure selfishness. So she did what she does, is very practical about things, sells up the house, and came down to wherever she is now telling this tale to some friends. But she doesn't forget him entirely. I think of him in certain lights, she says. Dawn, late afternoon, and if you think of the quality of light at those times of day, it's golden. And then there's this idea of her walking through the kitchen, catching a glimpse of a bowl of apples and them looking golden, and her stopping in her tracks, wondering, is he here? And this is the saddest sentence. I miss most, even now, his hands, his warm hands on my skin, his touch. And the irony is that everybody knows King Midas for his golden touch, and everybody's envious of that. Oh, you've got the golden touch. But in actual fact, what she wants is the old touch, the touch of his skin on hers when they could be intimate. And all that has been lost as a result of his greed. I hope that's been helpful. See you next time.